Real Washington, a podcast with thought leaders on what's coming next and how ideas become movements. Co-sponsored by the Corporate Council Business Journal, Compro, and the Snyder Center at the University of Maryland Smith School of Business.
Welcome to Real Washington, a podcast where we bring thought leaders from litigation and regulation, Wall Street to political movements to talk about what's next. With me in the studio today is former Puerto Rican Governor Pedro Rosselló, who's here to talk about what the statehood movement is in Puerto Rico, and George Laws, who is the acting executive director of the Puerto Rican Federal Affairs Administration. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. It's a great delight to have you here.
Thank you.
So I'd like to get right into the issue. George, can you tell us where Puerto Rico is now, a year and a half after the hurricane? That's when a lot of mainlanders paid a great deal of attention. Where are we now?
Well, the reality is that Puerto Rico is in a process of recovery still. We, going into the hurricane, had experienced a massive fiscal crisis, debt crisis, and we were also experiencing a process of population loss. And, it's important to have that context because when the storm hit, it wasn't just the devastation of the storm itself, although it is recognized as being one of the most severe natural events that has ever impacted an American jurisdiction, but really the level of deterioration that Puerto Rico's infrastructure was in was very significant, and the capacity of the state government of Puerto Rico to respond to that was also diminished because of all of these other factors that we had going on. So now, over a year and a half out from the storm, Puerto Rico is in a position where we've established a clear plan for how we want the recovery to take place. The governor of Puerto Rico, Ricardo Rosselló, which I'm honored to serve, has presented to Congress an economic and disaster recovery plan that's very comprehensive and not just looks at the areas where we need to have countermeasures in place should another storm occur, but really thinks about how we can build Puerto Rico back in a more resilient way and really think through addressing some of the key vulnerabilities for Puerto Rico, like building a new energy efficient grid that can be more resilient and also helps us move forward in terms of lowering costs of production for businesses and the cost for households, and also being more responsive to the reality of environmental change at the global level by integrating more renewable resources. So we're really advancing on that front quite a bit. It's been challenged by the delays in some of the federal funding, but we're really making big efforts to work to advance that forward. And aside from all of that, there's a number of different reforms that the governor has put in place that have really advanced Puerto Rico's prospects for the future. And those are advancements in the debt renegotiation process, advanced in the fiscal planning that we've undertaken as a result of PROMESA, which was the 2016 legislation that Congress passed to address Puerto Rico's fiscal and debt crisis. And then right now, the really big push is for attracting economic investment so that we can use this opportunity of this crisis that happened, which was terrible and tragic, and turn it into the potentiation of Puerto Rico's economy for the benefit of the U.S. citizens that live in Puerto Rico, but also for the benefit of the rest of America, because there's about 60 or $70 billion worth of interstate commerce that happens every single year between Puerto Rico and the States. So if Puerto Rico succeeds, there's businesses and jobs stateside that succeed as well. The key challenge that we have, though, and irrespective of everything that we're doing, because of our current territorial status, Puerto Rico does not have an equal playing field in terms of the federal policies and laws that impact us. And we don't have a full capacity to voice our needs through the federal legislative process or through the federal executive process, voting for president, that should enable us to make sure that our needs are taken into account. So territory status is a fundamental limitation on our capacity to achieve full recovery and to maximize our economic potential.
Well, George, thank you, because I think we got to everything we wanted to cover in your answer there, so we can now go off the air. Governor, let's move forward by moving backwards. Talk to us about the history of Puerto Rico, how it became a territory. There's really a century of history that I think we need to bring everyone up to speed on pretty quickly.
Well, let me try to answer that. It's a long history, as you mentioned, but we can go back to the point where Puerto Rico becomes a part or a possession of the United States, and that's 1898, at the end of the Hispanic-American War. At that time, the war was terminated by a Treaty of Paris, that was signed that had certain dispositions applicable to Puerto Rico. A fundamental one was that the U.S. was acquiring this territory, and that the rights and privileges and duties of the people that inhabited the island were up to Congress. In other words, Congress had powers to define how the people of Puerto Rico at that time would come into the American family. At that time, another thing happened in the U.S. Courts, in the federal courts, where for the first time in history, Puerto Rico was coming in as a territory. And before that, territories came in, and they were territories. But the Supreme Court, through a series of cases that collectively are known as the insular cases, came to define a new doctrine. Not necessarily, you will not find it in the Constitution, but it's a judicial interpretation that territories could be incorporated or unincorporated. And in that sense, the unincorporated territory did not have to have all the rights and privileges that citizens had in a incorporated territory. But Puerto Rico was defined as an unincorporated territory, which means that the full extent of the U.S. Constitution does not apply. It depends on the different decisions that Congress made relative to Puerto Rico. That advanced until 1917. At that time, Congress decided to grant citizenship to all people born in Puerto Rico from then on. So since 1917, we have become U.S. citizens. And so for more than a century, Puerto Ricans have been naturally born U.S. citizens. And then fast forward, several developments and evolution have led us to a state structure which is very similar to any state. It's a Republican type of structure, has the legislative, the judicial, and the executive, as in any state. And it is fully democratic, elected by the people of Puerto Rico. So the main difference is that we do not participate in the national context. In the federal context, Puerto Rico has no voting representatives in Congress. Puerto Rico has no voting electors to elect the President of the United States. And Puerto Rico does not fully participate either in the rights and benefits, but also in the responsibilities that other citizens have in any of the 50 states. So it's been an evolution. Initial point, 1898, evolving into a community now of fully 3.3 million U.S. citizens residing in a territory which does not partake of equal rights and responsibilities with the citizens in other states.
What will statehood mean? What would statehood mean to Puerto Rico?
Let me answer that by saying that it would mean something for Puerto Rico, and it would mean something for the nation, for the U.S. For the U.S., I see it as a continuing movement, evolution into this more perfect union, because certainly the U.S., as it has evolved, is not the same as it started. So from the perspective of the United States, the Union, we have a group of citizens that do not participate in the American democracy. So in evolving into a model which is a more perfect union, I think that's a great value from the perspective of the nation as a whole. In terms of Puerto Rico, it means that the U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico can participate fully as any other citizen. It's a call for equality. It's a call for recognition of the civil rights that we should have as every other U.S. citizen has. So it's I think, beneficial, and it's advantage to both in this equation. From my perspective, obviously, I'm arguing for the people of Puerto Rico here. It is an opportunity, first, for us to show what we can do as fully participant citizens. Secondly, once given the opportunity, to show that we can help in the further development of the nation, and not be seen as an appendix, and not be seen as something of a negative force. And so in the type of model that the U.S. is supposed to be based on, it's based on citizen equality. So both from the nation's point of view and from Puerto Rico's point of view, the people that live there, I think that's the main benefit.
And George, from your perspective, what's the argument that you make to the average Puerto Rican citizen? What's the benefit of becoming a state?
Well, I think that the average person in Puerto Rico is concerned about a lot of the same things that the average American everywhere is concerned about. Do I have good job opportunities that I can pursue? Am I able to get affordable health care? Is there good schools? Are there good schools available for my children? What are the costs of education? So, a lot of the exact same everyday bread and butter concerns that Americans have in the Midwest, in the South, in Northeast, everywhere are shared in Puerto Rico. The challenge is, though, that under our current territory status, the Supreme Court has determined that Congress can treat Puerto Rico unequally under federal laws. And because we don't have full representation in Congress, Congress can and does discriminate against us in a number of different ways. So there's a series of examples of everyday things that we take for granted here in the States that the average person in Puerto Rico does not get treated equally under. And examples of that range from funding for highways. You're driving down the street and you hit more bumps in Puerto Rico. It's not a coincidence. We have an unequal treatment in federal highway funding, and things that are even more personal and fundamental. Average person has, elderly parents or grandparents that take medication. Well, in Puerto Rico, we don't get, Medicaid prescription Part D. And that means that for whatever reason, Congress has instituted policies where the need for medication for elderly Americans stateside is valued more than the need for medication for elderly people in Puerto Rico. And that's fundamentally unfair and doesn't make sense.
And incredibly ironic, since your main export around the world is pharmaceuticals.
Exactly. So, I think that for a lot of the people on the island, statehood is really, in a lot of ways, about those bread and butter issues of them having the best possible opportunities, right, to have economic development on the island and the capacity to impact the federal laws that set the boundaries of what's possible, whether that's international trade or transportation laws or, federal environmental laws or labor laws, whatever else. We live under federal laws. We're subject to federal laws, but we don't have full participation in making those laws. And that puts us at a disadvantage because oftentimes Congress will decide to treat us differently or not take into account the particular needs of Puerto Rico when it's executing those laws. So, I think that the vast majority of people, that's really what it's about. And In order to address that, you really need statehood because you need to have the representation.
And so both of you spend a lot of time on the Hill. What's the argument that you make to members of Congress on the importance for all of America for Puerto Rico to have statehood?
Well, as I mentioned before, first of all, Congress should understand that they have the responsibilities for territories. One of the issues in territories is that, in particular at this point for Puerto Rico, you could say that it's a failed colonial experiment. In other words, the Congress has a territory which is a colony under international terms, which is failed. It's a failed experiment, and I'm not going to go into blaming people, whatever happened before.
But we'll do that on the next show. So we've got plenty of time to get to it.
I need a lot of time for that. But essentially, Congress has to understand that when some people say, well, if we bring in Puerto Rico, that will be an added burden. The burden is now. The burden is a colony that's failed, that is under the responsibility directly of Congress. So they have a problem in their hands. What we're saying, or what I'm trying to say is that Puerto Rico comes in, we expect nothing more than to be treated equally. We expect nothing more than to have the same opportunities to show that we can be productive and that we can contribute to the nation as a whole. So it's not an issue that you can say, well, statehood will bring a redistribution of resources. It will. And as a matter of fact, I think it's fair to say that when Puerto Rico becomes a state, there will be a reshuffling. More resources would go to the lower classes, lower economic classes. And obviously, the higher economic classes will have to contribute more because they will have to contribute equally under the tax laws that apply to every state, which in Puerto Rico, there's an exemption of income that is produced in Puerto Rico from federal taxation. We pay federal taxes, but for other areas. So essentially, the basis of the argument is that you have this, I think, anachronic way of managing a population of people which limits their capacity, which then puts a burden on the Congress and on the nation, because as we can see now, if there's a fiscal problem in Puerto Rico, Congress cannot just say, okay, forget it, we won't get involved. No, Congress understands that they have a responsibility for Puerto Rico and the other territories. So it's for me, it's a very simple equation.
Governor, don't you think there's also a lot of myths domestically here where because citizens tend not, particularly in this age of social media, we look at issues for 30 seconds and then we're on to the next thing. There are a lot of myths that pervade. Oh, well, if Puerto Rico becomes a state, then we assume the debt. If Puerto Rico becomes a state, oh, it will be a democratic state and it would shift the power in the United States Congress, and others as well. How do you deal with those myths?
Sometimes in the past, territories that had debt were assumed by the federal government. I mean, that has happened. It doesn't mean that it has to happen here. In the transition period from territory to a state, Congress has always looked at the specific situation and given or taken, but given some, prerogatives. For example, in one of the states, they had a very poor educational system, so they gave a lot of resources and funds to build up the educational system. So what I'm saying is that, yes, there will be adjustments. The debt is something that we have to look. But what I'm saying is that unless Puerto Rico and the people of Puerto Rico, the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, are allowed full range for their opportunities to demonstrate that they can be productive, then the problem is still there. The only way you can do away with that is that you allow the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico to fully participate. And let me add something here. This is not a question of citizenship per se. It is a geographic question because Puerto Ricans, as we have discussed, are U.S. citizens for over a century. Any Puerto Rican that moves from Puerto Rico to any of the states, immediately he acquires all the rights of citizenship. Immediately. They can vote for president, have their representatives. They participate fully in all the federal programs. On the other side, any U.S. citizen born in any of the 50 states that decides to move to Puerto Rico to establish residency in Puerto Rico, they lose their rights. I mean, it's like a black hole. And it's more unique because if that same U.S. citizen born in one of the states moves to a foreign country, moves to Venezuela or moves to France, they still retain their right to vote for the president through absentee ballot. That same citizen that can vote in Caracas or can vote in Paris would not be able to vote in Puerto Rico. So you can see that the problem is reduced to a geographic black hole that exists in Puerto Rico in terms of citizen rights and responsibilities.
Well, given where politics are today, I think we'd all choose Paris. But
so you can have your choice, but in any case, you can still vote.
Thank you. So, George, where you've had 5 votes on statehood over the last number of years. Where does the average Puerto Rican stand? Where does the population stand on the issue?
Well, I think that the votes themselves show a clear trend, right? And the clear trend is that as the diminished capacity of the current territory status to really provide for not only the needs but also the aspirations of the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, because we aspire to be a productive, prosperous society, right? Like everyone else does. As the capacity of the territory to meet those needs and aspirations has been shown to be deficient and incapable of really yielding the results that we need, you've seen more and more people look towards statehood as their preferred option. And I think that another critical factor is also the impact of, migration. Over the last 120 years that Puerto Rico has been part of the United States, we have had the capacity to move stateside. And at this point, there's a larger population of Puerto Ricans living in the 50 states than on the island. There's about 5.5 million Puerto Ricans living stateside, and 3.3 or 3.2. The census numbers are still out on the exact population of Puerto Rico right now. Hopefully, with the next census, we'll get a clearer picture on that. So people have voted with their feet, as you would say, and clearly. The statistics show that the Puerto Ricans that have moved stateside are doing better economically and educationally than the Puerto Ricans that remain on the island. It's not because the talent pool is different. It's the same groups of people. It's just that the opportunity is different. And with the votes, what we've seen, particularly in 2012, voters were asked in that election 2 questions. One is, do you want to continue under the current territory status? And a clear majority said no. Now that's pretty significant, and I'll tell you why. America's founding documents, including the Declaration of Independence, were premised on this idea of government by the consent of the governed, right? So we fought the American Revolution against a tyrannical monarch, right? The colonists, they said, we want to rule ourselves. And that's what the whole idea of American democracy was based on. And the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico do not want or consent to being governed under the current territory status, right? And then the second question in that vote was which one of the non-territorial options that you preferred. And at that time, statehood gained over 2/3 of voters, or approximately 2/3 of voters supported statehood over independence and sovereign association, which is another form of independence. And, Congress took some action on that, right? There was appropriation that was made to allow for a federally sponsored process to determine Puerto Rico's future political status. And that funding is still available for the government of Puerto Rico to use, although it does require approval by the U.S. Department of Justice. But otherwise, Congress has not acted on the legislation that has been presented by the past resident commissioner, Pedro, and the current resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez, that seeks to implement the will of voters. And then in 2017, the current governor, Ricardo Rosselló, he worked with our state legislature to call for another vote, and that vote took place in June 2017. So we're just at the 2-year anniversary of that. And in that vote, which we sought to get approval from DOJ so that it would be a federally sanctioned process. Unfortunately, that didn't pan out for a number of reasons. But Puerto Ricans, U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico were given 3 options, right? Statehood, independence, or continue with the current territory. And of the people who participated in that vote, an overwhelming majority, over 98%, voted for statehood. A lot has been said about the low participation
23%.
rate on that. Yeah. And one of the things that I find absolutely ironic about that being used as an argument to invalidate or diminish the validity of that vote is that in a democracy, you have to abide by the will of the legitimate expression of suffrage by the citizens that actually participate, because otherwise any action that you take, you could say as someone from the outside, oh no, that isn't a legitimate decision because not enough people participated. That it doesn't make logical sense. You would ever be able to take any affirmative decisions about anything if you went by that.
So, Governor, what happens next? Where are we going to see statehood in the next number of years? What happens next?
Well, my hope is that we are approaching the time when Congress will act and will respond to the will of the people of Puerto Rico, and that we will see a new state come into the Union. That's my hope. That has to be tempered by the history of inaction by Congress. In other words, over 120 years with really no congressional initiative to solve this unresolved problem of political status of Puerto Rico. So I have to temper it a little bit because I'm well aware of the history. But I think things have changed. And you were talking about the hurricanes that hit Puerto Rico. It's interesting that before the hurricanes hit Puerto Rico, very few U.S. citizens in the States realized that Puerto Ricans were U.S. citizens. Very few. Now, polls show that over 80% of U.S. citizens in the States know that Puerto Ricans are also fellow U.S. citizens. So it's a big change. It's a big game changer. Secondly, I think there have been, through judicial decisions in the federal courts, a paring down of this colonial situation that we have now, really putting into question the validity of continuing with that relationship in a modern world, which has eschewed colonialism. You know, it's incredible. The colonialism as a phenomenon globally, at one point was the way that most of the people in the world were governed, through colonialism. That went through certain waves. In the 19th century, the Americas were basically rid of colonialism. Then in the 20th century, Africa, Asia. And to this point, Puerto Rico remains as the only standing colony, the biggest and most populous in the whole world. And I think it's something that sticks out that has to be resolved. So I'm very hopeful that all these issues are coming to a head. Some of the reasons that were espoused before for different territories becoming state have been answered for Puerto Rico. For example, Puerto Rico is not contiguous to the rest of the state, but neither is Hawaii, and that has been answered. Puerto Rico comes in now, admittedly a Hispanic culture, but the profile of the United States has changed into a more diverse and an inclusive type of society, which also allows Puerto Rico to be seen not as a foreign culture, but as a very appropriate culture within this diverse mosaic that has become the United States. So for all those reasons, I'm very hopeful. I think that when we go on our rounds on the Hill, we see an opening that, frankly, I had not seen there before.
So it's different now.
It is absolutely different. There's some, people will say, well, and you mentioned it, what will it do to the political balance? And I think that's a very appropriate question because the history of territories coming in and becoming state had one very characteristic situation where usually they came in tandem to maintain the balance. Before the Civil War, it was a pro-slavery and a free state would come in together, maintain the balance. Subsequent to that, it's been Republican and Democrat. So a Republican and a Democrat territory would come in, maintain the balance. And that happened the last time in 1959 when Alaska and Hawaii came in. And they were supposed to maintain the balance, except we were not very good in predicting how that balance would be maintained. And so the Alaska was supposed to be Democratic, and Hawaii was supposed to be Republican. And you know that what happened was completely the opposite. The balance was maintained. So in answering that question, yes, what does Puerto Rico do to the balance? Well, we don't have a sister territory to come in with us. We don't. And so the only thing we can say, and I can say this because I believe this, is that Puerto Rico would be a mixed Republican-Democrat. It would not be a solid delegation for one party or the other. And why do I say that? Most of the elected officials stateside in Puerto Rico now are Republicans, most of them. On the other hand, a lot of the populations in stateside that are Puerto Rican vote Democratic. So there's certain factors on one side or the other. If you look at the governors of Puerto Rico, they've been Republicans and they've been Democrats. So that our history is that we would not come in as a monolithic one-party state. Yep. We would come in as a balanced state, and the future of that definition would depend on how the political parties deal with Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I think that this is something that, we've seen a lot of, in Congress is a lot of concern about, the political balance. And, the governor was pointing at some facts that are really often overlooked. There have been statewide elected officials in Puerto Rico that are Republican that have been successful. I served under Governor Fortuño, who's our, Republican governor from 2009 to 2012. Our current resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez, is a Republican. She serves in the House right now.
Supports statehood.
Yeah, and supports statehood. Both of them support statehood, right? And the other part that's actually really interesting about this issue is that if you look at the way in which the national political parties have looked at the issue of statehood throughout history, the Republican Party has had a pretty strong stance in support of statehood for Puerto Rico. President Reagan was a supporter of statehood for Puerto Rico, and there's both op-eds that he wrote about that and speeches that are on the record with those statements. President Ford helped to present a bill to admit Puerto Rico as a state of the union during his tenure. George Herbert Walker Bush famously included his support for Puerto Rico's statehood in a State of the Union speech and was very vocal about that. So, sometimes people tend to think that this is, an issue that falls exclusively along party lines and that Puerto Rico is definitely going to be a democratic jurisdiction. And it's not necessarily that clear cut. It's clearly something that both Democrats and Republicans stateside have supported, and in Puerto Rico, voters have supported both Democratic and Republican officials.
Does D.C. complicate that for you? You said earlier, Governor, there's not a sister territory, but there is a sister colony.
Yes, that's true. Let me say that we, the statehood movement in Puerto Rico, fully support the statehood for Washington, D.C. on the same basis, equal treatment for U.S. citizens. And I think it's untenable to have the position that, again, because a U.S. citizen lives in D.C., a certain geographical area, they should have less opportunity to participate in the democratic process. So fully advocate and support that. On the other hand, there's a question whether Puerto Rico's path and DC's path is the same, because DC's situation is in the Constitution. It's a definite enclave that is defined in the Constitution. Some people posit that you would have to amend the Constitution to have D.C. participate fully, although other people have come around that. For example, redefining what the district is, in terms of territory. But for Puerto Rico, it's simply an act of Congress. I mean, it's as simple as that. A majority in both houses and a signature by the president would have Puerto Rico come in as a state. So the process is a little different. The politics are also a little different because obviously D.C. would be heavily Democratic. Everything points to that. Puerto Rico, as I mentioned before, has its own internal balance of Republican and Democratic. So it's a little bit different, but on the principle, it's the same principle. U.S. citizens should have all the rights, privileges, and responsibilities, no matter where they live.
So here you are, 120-year campaign, which even by this Congress is slightly slow in terms of not getting anything done. What's standing in their way?
Well, I think we've mentioned some of those. In fact, the belief that it will alter the political balance. I mean, that's very strong. Secondly, we have mentioned also the belief that Puerto Rico as a state would be a financial burden, a fiscal burden, which we have talked to, and it's really not true. Third, the belief or the argument by some that Puerto Rico has a particular cultural definition that doesn't fit in the nation, like a Hispanic culture, which, as a matter of fact, would come in exactly with what today is the biggest minority population in the United States. So it's not really foreign. And so these are arguments that have been used. But I think if you get a chance to sit down with reasonable, logical people, and you go through the history, and you go through the principles, and you look at the perspective from the nation, from what the U.S. is supposed to mean and how it's supposed to act, then my experience is almost all are come in agreement. Where is the resistance? I would say mostly it's a question of whether it would alter the political balance.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that is also impacting Congress is that, right now our legislative process has devolved for all issues in a number of different ways, and the facts bear this out. We've seen fewer major pieces of legislation come through Congress in the last several sessions. Appropriations processes being stalled over and over again, and continuing resolutions being used to fund the economy and the government of the most powerful country on earth. So overall, Congress is less of a forward-looking body than it is a reactive body, and for many
this Congress,
not only this Congress, the past sessions too, and prospectively, I don't see that really changing in the near future. But for a long time, Puerto Rico wasn't a crisis. It was just kind of a benign neglect situation, right? So they're kind of going over there. Everything's more or less okay. We don't really have to worry too much about it. So why are we going to, really put it at the top of the agenda?
Let me interject
that changed
something. Well, not only it changed. If you look at the history of major social changes in the United States, amazingly, it hasn't come through congressional action.
Mm-hmm.
It has come, in many cases, through actions in the federal courts. So if you look at the issue of African American rights, civil rights, ultimately it was the Supreme Court that said, no, this is not tenable, this is unconstitutional, so you have to change. If you look at the civil rights of women, for example, and you have the very salient history of current Justice Bader, it was through challenges in the court that changed. So I think that that route, that avenue, is opening up with a series of cases that have been decided and are in the process of being decided that may have the judicial branch taking the initiative and saying, no, it is untenable that you have U.S. citizens that are not treated equally at this time. So I just open up that possibility because, yes, we're working with Congress, but we might have the answer ultimately to a major change through the federal courts.
Governor, you raised a really important issue about the power of courts and the judiciary to impact critical issues. You mentioned the civil rights movement as one, of course, Brown versus Board of Education 1, Brown versus Board 2. Although it took through 1980, we saw a 2-decade process before that decision was actually fully implemented in all the states.
At all, what was it? All deliberate speed or something like that?
All deliberate speed.
So
it took a while. It didn't take 120 years, but it took 20. But the same with the women's movement, and certainly Sandra Day O'Connor being appointed to the Supreme Court and beginning now a foundation of a different perspective. But having said that, there was a grassroots movement in both cases, the women's movement, Gloria Steinem, the civil rights movement, letter from a Birmingham jail, and Martin Luther King. Is there a commensurate movement that we're seeing that helps support the inertia of Congress, that helps influence the courts?
Well, let me try to answer that in this way. One of the disadvantages that we have in that respect is that we're a community of U.S. citizens, but we live in an island, 1,200 miles from the coast of Florida. We have no vote. We have no way to influence a priori the decisions. In each of those cases, you have African American, who are a significant part of the population, and mostly in the east and south coast of the United States. They had the opportunity of participating, although they were limited, but they had an intrinsic force that could be used to mobilize. Same with women. Women, they're the majority, really. And so we do not have a constituency that can easily insert itself in the process of decision. So in a sense, we have to rely on the judgment of the judges and the justices to do what is right. to do what is fair, to do what is constitutionally accepted, and less of a power in terms of mobilizing the public opinion. We have to realize that you're 3.2 million U.S. citizens, but you're in this island, which is, as famously said by one of our presidents, surrounded by a big ocean.
I've heard that.
So that's where
we can still drop paper towels there.
Yes, that's right. So I think you bring a good point. Where's the mobilization? Where it's very difficult for us. We're not in the mix of the decision-making process.
Well, Governor, one thing that I think is an asset that our movement has is the fact that as terrible as all of the out-migration from Puerto Rico has been, because obviously it diminishes our labor force, it diminishes our tax base, it diminishes our economic consumption and our productive capacity. But what it's also done is actually take the disenfranchised citizens of the island and put them in places where they can register to vote, and they're voting, right? So whereas previously the enclaves of where Puerto Ricans moved in the 1940s and 50s were mostly in the northeast of the United States and Chicago and Philadelphia, New York, those places. What we've seen in the past decade is a diversification of different jurisdictions where you have Puerto Ricans moving to. We have growth in Puerto Rican populations in states that you just wouldn't really think of necessarily, like Ohio or Texas, and most notably Florida. And Florida really stands as kind of the key place for the potential political influence of the stateside Puerto Rican community in support of making Puerto Rico statehood a national issue. And why is that? Well, Florida is the swing state of swing states, right? So for national presidential elections, Florida is one of the key places. And what you've seen...
I think we have a framed hanging Chad over in the corner of the studio.
There you go. And what you've seen there is that Puerto Rican voters in Florida have shown themselves to be swing voters, right? So they've voted for Jeb Bush in the past. They voted for Barack Obama. They've also voted for Marco Rubio and Rick Scott. So, I mean, it really shows you that the voters aren't beholden to one political party or another. They're really going to be responsive to the political figures that communicate to their needs, to their interests, to their aspirations. And one of the most clearly established ones is for Puerto Rico to have an end to its territory status and for Puerto Rico to be granted statehood. And poll after poll has shown that Puerto Rican voters in Florida overwhelmingly by 70% support statehood for Puerto Rico.
So isn't this the remaining missing element? You've got movement in the courts, you have movement and opportunity in Congress, you have periodic bipartisan support. If we look at post-World War II, the budding Israeli movement and the lobby here, a model followed by India and other countries in terms of a term that's not perfectly adaptable, but for the diaspora that we're living here. And for Toyota in the 80s, building factories in key congressional districts on the corporate level to build a grassroots support. This is really, I think, the element that you're saying is that with that, it would really help to expedite some of the other successes you're having in other areas.
That's been the focus of Governor Ricardo Rosselló. So as a response to the 2017 plebiscite that I mentioned earlier, where voters overwhelmingly supported statehood, there was parallel legislation that was approved to create something called the Puerto Rico Statehood Commission. And Governor Pedro Rosselló chairs that commission. It consists of 7 members, equally divided, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and 1 independent, to essentially mirror the congressional delegation that Puerto Rico would have if it were a state with 2 senators and 5 representatives in the House. And part of the work that the Puerto Rico Federal Affairs Administration has been supporting the Puerto Rico Statehood Commission in carrying out is not just doing all of the lobbying in Congress and knocking on doors and building relationships there with members on, both the right and the left, but also reaching out to other organizations and outside stakeholders that, share common values with us and that understand the civil rights issues that are at question here. So the Statehood Commission has been engaging other organizations, including Hispanic organizations like LULAC at the national level. We've engaged with the NAACP. We've engaged with some veteran organizations because obviously there's a huge veteran community from Puerto Rico and many stateside veterans served with Puerto Ricans, so they know the level of sacrifice that these Americans, fellow Americans, have made on behalf of our country, and they recognize the value in that, and they know the inherent unfairness of being equal at war, but not equal in peace.
What a great point to make, George. The disproportionate number of Puerto Ricans who serve in the American military, and as you say, truly defend our country and provide a generation of heroism, and yet not fully appreciated or understood on the mainland.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's not just, those types of organizations. There's also been outreach efforts to organizations that look after, taxpayer interests. The National Taxpayer Union recently, released a report analyzing the potential impact of statehood in terms of federal expenditures and tax issues. And they determined that it's better for the American taxpayer if Puerto Rico becomes a state. And the rationale for that is simple, right? As a territory, because we have an unequal playing field, we are always going to have suboptimal economic outcomes, right? If Puerto Rico's provided that equal playing field, then we can maximize the full potential of Puerto Rico's economy. And through interstate commerce, we actually help buy more goods and services stateside and create more jobs and more economic opportunity in the state. So, it's really taking this situation from a democratic deficit and economic deficit into a win-win.
I think what you're saying is, read my lips, no more taxes, but more taxpayers.
Yeah, there you go.
so now we have our theme.
That's a good way of putting it. I think I'll adopt that.
Okay, thank you. We do charge for these taglines, though.
Right.
So we're nearing the end of the program. What's an argument that you would say is the most significant one against statehood?
I think I would summarize it in two. One of them is for the people of Puerto Rico, the, from my perspective, erroneous interpretation that we would pay more taxes. As I said before, more federal taxes. We were exempt from federal taxes for income that we produce in Puerto Rico as a territory. So that we would have to pay equal taxes for if we lived in any of the states. That goes disproportionately to a certain class. Most of the population of Puerto Rico would be exempt because of the level of their income from paying federal taxes. But the better off economic population would have to pay federal taxes. So that's one argument, which I think if you look at the balance, people argue that, assuming that there would be a static scenario. Puerto Rico has now the highest state taxes. Why? Because even though we don't pay those federal taxes, we have to do a lot of the functions that the federal government does for the states. So we have, again, a big government that has to be supported through taxes. And we have a very high state tax. When the federal government comes in and treats Puerto Rico as a state, the state of Puerto Rico will not have to do that. So that will automatically lower the state taxes that apply to the citizens of Puerto Rico. So I think the argument, it's more of a fear argument, and it's more of a fear argument to some levels of the economic distribution in Puerto Rico. The other one is the other argument that it's more emotional than rational. It's the cultural aspect. Some people say, oh, if Puerto Rico becomes a state, we will lose our identity. We will lose our culture. We will lose our personality. The truth of the matter is that as a state, you would have more power to really promote your culture, to maintain whatever you want to maintain as far as your personality. And also, you have an experiment in nature. You have, as George mentioned, more Puerto Ricans living stateside than in the island. Since when did they become not Puerto Ricans? I mean, they're still Puerto Ricans. They still love a lot of the local customs, the food, and the family connections. So I think it's really an emotional argument. And as you know, emotional arguments are sometimes difficult to counteract. So the first one, we can rationally dissect the question of taxes. The cultural or identity aspect is more iffy because it's based not on facts or evaluation or evidence. It's based on a lot of emotion.
Closing comments?
Yeah, I think that one thing that is really important for our listeners to take away is thinking about how this issue reflects on America as a society, and as part of the world. The governor here has a book that he wrote entitled "The Unfinished Business of American Democracy," and really addressing this issue of Puerto Rico's unfinished, political status and where ultimately we'll fit in relation to the broader American family is something that strikes at the core of who we are as a country. And right now, America's facing a number of different challenges. Our democracy is being tested in a number of different ways. And I firmly believe that adding Puerto Rico as a State of the Union is something that will help strengthen America because we're already Americans. We've been Americans for 120 years. We've shown our loyalty and our dedication to this country and contributed in a countless different ways, from sports with people like Roberto Clemente to, music and entertainment, from, Ricky Martin to J-Lo. In the sciences field, we've got Joseph Acaba, who was a astronaut with NASA. And we want to continue contributing to this country, from the 65th Infantry Regiment, which, received a Congressional Gold Medal for their heroism in the war in Korea, to Sonia Sotomayor, who now sits on the Supreme Court of the United States. Puerto Ricans are not something separate. We are woven into the fundamental fabric of American society. And it's just time that we received the full recognition and rights and equality that would allow us to fully participate.
Hard to top that, Governor. Last word?
Well, in addition and parallel to the very adequate description that George has given from the perspective of the nation of the United States, there's also another perspective, and I have written another book that has to do with the concept of colonialism. So it's a global perspective. And as I mentioned before, the United States, which was created as a response against colonialism, against at that time British colonialism, is incredibly almost the last power to maintain a colonial establishment. This is an outmoded way of dealing with populations. It's no longer accepted by anybody. And so it behooves the United States, in terms of its position in the world, to stop being a colonial power. And it's as simple as that. So internally, from the history, from the principles of democracy within the United States, and outside from the principles of nations that have declared that colonialism is no longer accepted, I think that change is necessary and I hope imminent.
Governor, you broke our strict rule. You can only hawk one book per show here, so we're going to have you back on.
All right.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. Governor
Thank you.
George, thank you. And this is Richard Levick with Real Washington. Thank you both so much.
Join the conversation and follow @Levick on Twitter. Don't forget to subscribe to Real Washington on your favorite podcast app. and leave a 5-star review. Levick, fixing the impossible.